Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 10th and final webinar in the series Bite-Sized Training for All as part of the celebration of the 50 years of the Protection of Wrecks Act. I'm Peter Knott, Education Manager of the Nautical Archaeology Society. Today's webinar is Historic Human Remains in the Marine Environment. The presenter today is Alistair Byford-Bates from MSDS Marine and Heritage. Thank you, Alistair.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening. I hope you will find today's presentation of interest. To give you a little bit of my background, my name's Alistair. I studied human osteology for both my degrees at university, and for the last 7-8 years, I've worked as a marine archaeologist, currently being a senior project officer at MSDS Marine and Heritage. Therefore, I have fairly extensive experience in recording, excavation and recovery of both ship and aircraft material, marine planning, consenting, and previously in the recovery of human remains, having worked on both Romano-British, Roman, Anglo-Saxon and post-medieval cemetery complexes. Tonight's presentation is designed to inform you as divers of your responsibilities should you come across human remains during a diving project on a wreck within English territorial waters, so out to the 12 nautical miles. It does not cover the legislation for the other nations of the United Kingdom and only covers international guidance and agreements where they are pertinent to the presentation. So I would recommend that people look to other sources for the information. Some of it is in the handouts, but I would recommend getting additional guidance. Presentation is not designed to be a comprehensive guide, but an aid to what divers should do on encountering human remains, both in expected and unexpected contexts. In most circumstances, it would be expected that prior research and planning would inform the project team as to the potential possibility of human remains existing on a site. However, there still is that possibility of unexpected remains being discovered. Human remains are one of the most informative sources of evidence about our past, with new techniques and analytical methods furthering increasing the information that can be gathered from them. However, the corollary to this is the status we award human remains as people rather than objects, therefore makes them subject to additional ethical and legal considerations over and above those already considered for other archaeological material. So the presentation will cover the following topics. We will begin with when and where divers might encounter human remains in the underwater environment, and with a brief introduction into how to tell whether they're human or animal. This will inform project planning and what is required before entering the water. For this reason, it is important to go over the legal and ethical frameworks that surround dealing with human remains. Once that has been established, the focus must be on the physical well-being of the remains, and therefore first aid conservation will be discussed, however not in very much detail. We'll finish with the research potential of human remains and what we can learn from them with a case study. As you can imagine, it is necessary to include images of human skeletal material in this presentation, and you will be warned now, and I will try to warn you before each slide as they come up. For your information, all of the slides come from publicly available sources and news sources, and therefore there should not be anything that should surprise people in terms of if you read up on human remains or have studied them in the past or current in your archaeological reading. In the UK, there are several guidelines on the legal, ethical and scientific research that can be carried out on human remains in relation to terrestrial sites, though there is little specific material related to marine sites. These do, however, serve as good examples of best practice and how it can be applied to a marine site. And it should be borne in mind that none of the legislation that will be discussed was drawn up with any consideration for the archaeological excavation or recovery of remains. Where are divers likely to encounter human remains underwater? On archaeological shipwreck sites, human remains are found comparatively rarely. Since in the event of a disaster, there is a tendency to abandon ship. It is only when individuals get caught under heavy equipment, in tackle or netting, or in closed compartments that the remains are encapsulated in the wreck deposit. This is more likely to be the case for modern or technically advanced ships, particularly where iron and steel came into the construction techniques with watertight bulkheads and watertight doors, creating sealed spaces. Depending on the character of the vessel lost, there may still contain the obvious remains of crew lost. Deliberate foundings and scuttlings in war is one obvious example of this effect, where crew and remains are not recovered before the sinking event. As will become clear from the section on legislation, it should also be assumed that most plane wrecks are likely to contain human remains, and that a look but do not touch approach should be adopted. There is also the possibility that burials may be encountered in areas that have been submerged. Burials in this context are the deliberate act of placing remains in the ground. Remains are the whole or part remains of a human body, either at their location at death or the discovery location through the effects of external human or environmental factors moving the remains. Coroner's Unit of the Ministry of Justice issues licenses for human remains in archaeological contexts, regardless of whether they're deliberately or buried or not. The two examples here in the lower right-hand corner is the Antikythera wreck, which, as you can see, is deep technical diving and is very much a teamwork system for the recovery of things. And then the top image is a sports diver on a crashed American aircraft in the Mediterranean, where there has been a number of recovery operations done through the DPAA, so through the American military, rather than through recreational diving or archaeological contractors. So what happens to bodies in water? In general, only skeletal remains will be encountered, and relatively few substantial skeletal assemblages have been recovered and studied osteologically, with the three largest all being warships sunk close to home ports, namely the Vasa, Mary Rose, and the Cronin. However, there has also been material recovered from the London and the Salmi 1 ship burial site. And though not gone into very much detail, you may also be aware that remains were encountered on the 1744 HMS Victory, which were reburied on the site without being disturbed. Bone preservation is directly related to the speed of sedimentation. The faster the material is buried, the better preserved it is, particularly in terms of where marine invertebrates will be damaging it or attacking the remains. Gravity is a factor here as well. So as the sequence of pictures show, as a body decomposes in open water and the extremities fall away, we lose more and more material and more relevant material in terms of what could be useful as a research aid. This can be constrained by what the person is wearing and the environment they're in, and therefore, depending on whether they've been moved within the wreck or the wreck has opened up since their deposition, the degree of preservation and the degree of surviving material will be very variable. The first question to ask yourself when you come across any form of bone material is, can I recognize it as bone? Second point would be, is it human or non-human in origin? Context is key here. Therefore, the methodology adopted by you as the dive team will either produce good archaeology or leave lots of unanswered questions. Key amongst these is the question for what's thought to be non-human remains and whether you're looking for as part of a crew, a companion to the crew, an animal in transit, and finally, was it food for the crew? When you're looking at remains, are you looking at a relatively large bulbous skull as might be encountered in human remains? You look for the eyes being above the nose, and you think animals do not really have chins. If you're aware of the structure of the skull, you look for the position of the foramen magnum, which is the entrance to the spine in the base of the skull, and see how that is located. Would the skull sit above or in front of the spinal column when it is mounted on the skull? When you look at the pelvis, is it the traditional dish shape of human remains, or is it elongated like you might encounter in sheep or cattle? Humans have a noticeably flatter rib cage, and we have that well observed, very noticeable 3 curves to the spine related to the fact that we walk upright. There are similarities between us and animal bones, and pigs have very similar leg bones to humans. However, what is very noticeable is the size of them. So as you look at the four pictures, in the top left is as an example of a human femur. Alongside that is a human femur from a different angle. You then, down in the bottom left-hand corner, is a mandible. And then on the bottom right-hand side, you have a series of the leg bones. So you have the lower leg bones, and you also have the upper leg bones. All these pictures come from an island off the north coast of Kent, where they have been washing out of what was former cemetery site, believed to related to the hulks that were moored in the Thames estuary. As you can see from this image, there are similarities between both human and animal forelimbs. The three examples here being a grey seal, right foreflipper, the right hand of a human, and a brown bear. One of the key things to look at is at this point is when you have these remains, and if they are disarticulated and fragmentary, is have that expert on call to help with the identification. As previously mentioned, context is key here. Is there an expectation to find this sort of material based on the desk-based research carried out prior to the project? And is there the possibility that there might be a multiple wreck site in the location that you were unaware of, or possibly dump sites for refuse or industrial processes? Alternatively, is it cargo, or in the case of the humans, is it crew? Being unlikely to have grey seals or brown bears as either pets. Both brown bears and grey seals have been found to range across and around the UK, to give a little bit of context. However, brown bears appear to have finally become extinct in the UK in the early medieval period, around 400 to 600 AD, so after the Romans left, and in the early, what most people think of as sort of the mid-Anglo-Saxon period and early Viking period. Conversely, the UK is currently home to around 40% of the world's population of grey seals. One thing in context here is if you're looking at a sealing or whaling vessel, that they might have remains of these animals on board. Again, if you've got a trader within Northern Europe or North America, there might be brown bear material on board, but it seems very unlikely. And as I say, context is everything when it comes to looking at this material.
On encountering potential bone, the first question to ask yourself is whether it is recognisably bone, followed by is it human or non-human in origin. As previously mentioned, context is key here, therefore the methodology used will either produce good archaeology or leave lots of questions. Currently, there is no specific archaeological guide to the recovery of human skeletal remains from underwater, and therefore the methodologies utilised will generally be based on the best practices as laid out in the Guidance for Terrestrial Excavations. As before, was it cargo, companion or food? If the bones are hollow, are they possibly suited for flight? Turtle shell is known to mimic the compact bone of human skull pieces in some instances. Immature human bones do not match adult human bones, and therefore the expert guidance from an osteologist is critical to ensure the correct identification of material occurs. Check to see if the femur is the longest bone in the body for humans. Example of a femur is in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. Look for the separate bones in the lower legs of humans, the tibia and the fibula. Check for the less dense cortical bones in humans, with the cortical area about 1/4 the thickness of the whole bone. Cortical bone forms the long bone shafts, for example, and trabecular bone forms the spongy bone within them.
Here's quite an unusual example, but it's worth bearing in mind when looking at potential of remains on a wreck. They do survive, and they do survive a long time if the situation is correct for preservation. The Antikythera wreck is currently a unique example in many respects of the potential of human remains for a maritime site, in that the bone has a potential for DNA analysis. The material recovered consisted of a partial cranium with 3 teeth, 2 arm bones, several rib pieces and 2 femurs, all apparently from the same person. The cranial fragments included both petrous bones, which are just behind the ear. It comprises the dense sections of bone that also preserve DNA better than any other part of the skeleton or the teeth. How they survived so well is probably due to a combination of factors, including how deep in the wreck they were buried, how quickly they became entombed in sediment, the level of disturbance they suffered prior to discovery, the effect of the material around them on their preservation, acting to protect them. For example, copper acting as a biocide, and the depth of the wreck and its subsequent burial with cliff-form material and seabed sediment. What is interesting about these is there is a lot of iron staining around them. And the thought is that they are potentially slaves or people imprisoned within the hull who therefore didn't have the opportunity to escape when the ship sank. And because they were in the lower parts of the hull, their degree of preservation is better because they were more quickly covered in the sediment layer. A precautionary approach with the recovery of all materials above a certain size can help reduce the risk of missing material during recovery. As mentioned before, there is the risk of the missing the smaller bones, and when combined with the effects of immersion, taphonomic damage, which we will cover in a minute, poor visibility on a site and other external factors, it is relatively easy to miss pieces, particularly when unfamiliar with the individual bones or their fragmentary eroded remains. An example of this approach might be the use of block excavation for all material recovered to the surface for sieving, and then examination by an osteologist in a more controlled environment. However, this is an approach that is often beyond amateur archaeologists and is generally something for commercial projects or projects specifically recovering remains. Projects should be conducted according to established principles, including, as we're all aware, planning, fieldwork design, assessment of potential, analysis and report preparation, dissemination and archiving. And there is, in many respects, an ethical responsibility placed on anyone doing project planning if they're expecting to encounter human remains. And the possibility of dealing with human remains must be considered at all stages of the project, from planning to fieldwork design through conservation and assessment. There will also be extraordinary measures required for publication and dissemination, depending on the nature of the remains. And of course, they need to be archived appropriately. As with anything, there is a cost. At its most basic level, time is a factor. However, financial cost is significant when it comes to the recovery, conservation, and recording of human remains. And therefore, in terms of planning for a project of this nature, one needs to be very careful and consider what the outlay will be in the long term. The role of the osteologist. Having an anthropologist or osteologist involved from the beginning is crucial in both in terms of planning, but also for the identification of unexpected human remains. Their input into a project plan may also allow the following considerations, amongst others, to be considered both in terms of methodologies, but also in the interpretation of any observed recovery remains. Is it possible to digitally record the skeletal remains without disturbing them? Is it possible to gain sufficient information from the digital records of the bones, or do they need to be re-recorded? How are the remains affected by the brackish or salt water over time? That's a more long-term research question, but it's something that's becoming more, it's something that is not well understood and therefore requiring further research. How the remains affected by the marine sediments among them. So we're looking at things like degree of preservation, but also preservation of other material around the remains. What taphonomic changes to the remains can be observed? And if the recording, recovery, investigation, and conservation of the skeletal remains is to occur, what is the most suitable methodology, and will it impact further research into those remains? As part of the planning for this thing, we put together a basic flowchart. And the idea of the flowchart is to give you an image of both your legal responsibility in terms of when you recover material, but also in terms of what the processes are if you are going to go ahead and recover material. So if you find human remains, leave them where they are and don't disturb them in any way. There is a legal requirement to report all discoveries of human remains to the police and via them to the coroner for an area. England and Wales currently have 43 territorial police forces and 3 special police forces. The reporting process to each can vary in detail, and not all non-emergency call responders are aware of the processes operating within their force. And therefore, as part of the project planning stage, it is recommended that project leads and the project osteologists confirm the process with their local force or use of the emergency number. it should be needless to say that partial or non-skeletal remains should be treated as an emergency call. In some counties, the finds liaison officer and the county archaeologist will assist in the reporting process to the local police. And these may be a good first point of contact in finding out the process that you need to put in place. If the remains turn out to be of archaeological rather than forensic interest, the police, in all probability, will contact an archaeological service direct. That's maybe a county archaeologist, an academic institution, a regional unit, or an organisation they have worked with previously. There is no set guidance on what counts as a forensic interest or an archaeological interest, but the general cutoff is between 70 and 100 years. The idea being that once you get to 70 or 100 years, it would no longer be of interest to a court because the perpetrators are unlikely to still be alive, and therefore it by definition isn't forensic. It should be noted that not all forces operate marine units, and therefore response times may vary in terms of them taking into custody, investigating, or recovering of reported material. For example, Hampshire and White attended the dockside for the reported recovery of unexpected remains during the dredging as part of the access dredging for the QE2 aircraft carriers, took them into custody until the investigation was completed, and organised and planned all osteologists to have a look at it, and the material to be assessed by a pathologist, whereas unexpected material reported in Sussex were left in the care of the archaeological contractors they were passed to by the finder, with their osteological and marine biology assessments being submitted as evidence to the police of their origin and age, and being accepted into the record for them. The Ministry of Justice has indicated that its licensing requirements should apply to human remains found on wrecks and other maritime sites that are more than 100 years old. And professional standards related to human remains, such as those of the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, can also be expected to apply irrespective of the environment in which the human remains are found. If operating under a license covered by the Protection of Military Remains Act, the license is automatically suspended and the discovery must be immediately reported, in addition to reporting the discovery to the local police and through them the local coroner. It should be noted that licenses under the Protection of Military Remains Act are not issued if the possibility of remains being present on the if there is the possibility of remains being present on the site. The Ministry of Defence state that on no account should remains be touched, and they should always be treated with due respect. They state in their guidance that the feeling of relatives of the deceased cannot be emphasized too strongly. They also state that any presumed identity of remains should not be divulged in advance of an inquest, with the exception of the police, coroner, or Ministry of Defence themselves. We come to the law. So we have ecclesiastical and secular law to cover here. I will not go into them in too much depth. As ecclesiastical law is not applicable to burials located in the intertidal zone or below the low watermark, it is unlikely to apply to any marine site. An exception might be an area that has been inundated or been subject to erosion and inundation. If that is the case, then the three pieces of legislation might apply. But due to the remote likelihood of that being relevant, we won't be covering them in any detail today. A license from the Secretary of State for an exhumation license, which we'll cover in a second, is not required and cannot be granted where the remains are in consecrated land subject to the jurisdiction of the consistory court or under a Church of England cathedral or within its precincts, which is why these three pieces of church legislation are relevant. We have the Care of Churches and Ecclesiastical Jurisdiction Measures 1991, which consolidates several enactments related to ecclesiastical jurisdiction and the care of churches and other places of worship. The missional and pastoral, etc. amendments measures set out the legal proceedings for parish reorganisation and the closing of consecrated church buildings. And the Care of Cathedral Measures 2001 requires that no work be implemented which might materially affect the archaeological character of an archaeological remains in or under a cathedral church or within the precincts of a cathedral. As I say, unless you're going to be working on a site that is related to a church, very unlikely to need to know these three pieces of legislation, but they are relevant in terms of the wider understanding of the legislation that affects working with human remains in England. And as you can see here, there's quite an extensive list of which all are basically relevant. The provisions of the 1857 Burial Act extends to the 12 nautical mile territorial limit, measured from low mean water. It is therefore unlawful to disturb burials within this limit without first obtaining lawful authority to do so from the Ministry of Justice. The wording of the 1857 Act appears to refer to bodies or parts thereof which are deliberately buried, and therefore it seems to imply that human remains which end up in the sea and be covered by sand or sediments because of natural processes cannot be said to be buried under the terms of the Act. Thus, for example, human remains from wreck sites, even if they lie within 12 nautical miles, would not fall under the provisions, although deliberately buried human remains in submerged landscapes would. However, as a license is required for the disturbance, archaeological removal of human remains, regardless of whether they are buried or not, this should be considered a moot point, despite it being raised numerous times by people looking at human remains, both terrestrial and in the marine environment. The Disused Burial Grounds Act makes it unlawful to erect buildings on a burial ground which is no longer used for interment except for the purposes of enlarging a church. And this comes through the 1991 Care of Churches measure, which we mentioned before. The Disused Burial Grounds Amendment Act 1981 modifies the original act in relation to nonconformist burial grounds. And again, unlikely to be encountered, but they all tie in together in terms of the requirements when looking at archaeological excavations of human remains. The Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act and the Treasure Act both require that human remains should be screened to determine if they are subject to terms of the Burial Act or ecclesiastical law. Human remains less than 100 years old are subject to the Human Tissue Act. Under this act, a license is required from the Human Tissue Authority to hold material for the purposes scheduled under this act. Such purposes include scientific research and public display. The Marine and Coastal Access Act provisions should be considered dependent on the activity planned and therefore whether a licensable activity is to occur as part of the project planned. Merchant Shipping Act, as most of us are aware, pertains to marine salvage and should be followed informally. Even in the case of material not recovered, the receiver should be informed of discoveries and their location for their records. Protection of Wrecked Act provides protection for designated shipwrecks. Section 1 of the Act provides for wrecks to be designated because of their historical, archaeological, or artistic value. Section 2 provides for the designation of dangerous sites. Wreck sites must have a known location to be designated. Designated wrecks are marked on admiralty charts with their physical locations, sometimes marked by means of a buoy. As the PWA has been celebrating 50 years, I'm sure most of us are aware of the detail on this act and its limitations. Protection of Military Remains Act, as mentioned before, provides protection for wreckage of military aircraft and designated military vessels. The act provides for two types of protection: protected places and controlled sites. Military aircraft are automatically protected, but vessels must be specifically designated. The primary reason for designation is to protect the last resting place of fallen servicemen of any nation. While this is often referred to as protection of a war grave, the protected wrecks are not by definition graves, nor are they required to have been lost during wartime in order to be protected. Wrecks are designated by name and can be designated as protected places even if the location of the site is not known. Thus, as mentioned above, the wreckage of any British military aircraft is automatically a protected place, even if the physical remains have not been previously discovered or identified. Shipwrecks need to be specifically designated, and designation as a protected place applies only to vessels that sank after the 4th of August 1914. The Act makes it an offence to interfere with a protected place, to disturb the site, or to remove anything from the site. Divers may visit the site, but the rule is look, don't touch, and don't penetrate the wreck. The legislation is also applicable to the aircraft and ships of other nations, be they allies or enemies at the time of their loss. Control sites must be specifically designated by location, where the site contains the remains of an aircraft or a vessel that crashed, sank, or was stranded within the last 200 years. The Act makes it illegal to conduct any operations, including diving or excavation, within the control site that might disturb the remains unless licensed to do so by the MOD. Under the requirements of PMRA, a license is required to carry out any form of intrusive activity on an aircraft crash site. Licenses will generally only be issued if the site is considered to not contain human remains. The MOD guidance therefore allows for preliminary exploratory diving without a license for the purpose of identification, providing they are not tampered with or disturbed in any way. Any material recovered would also need to be reported under requirements of the Merchant Shipping Act and follow the terms of any marine license issued under the Marine and Coastal Access Act, including any requirements from Historic England as advisors to the Marine Management Organisation. Please be aware, as mentioned before, the law for Scotland differs on this, and that many of these acts do not apply. Likewise, in Northern Ireland, the guidance and requirements prior to excavations differ. The ethical treatment of human remains involves making decisions, considering via appropriate consultation the views of individuals and groups with legitimate interests in those remains. These interests include those of the dead themselves and their surviving family members and descendants, the church and other organisations responsible for the care of the dead, the public, particularly those with direct links to the place of burial, and the scientific research community, including archaeologists, sociologists, and medical and forensic scientists. Secular ethics encompass both knowledge-based ethics and ethics associated with the need for respectful treatment of human remains. Frequently, these two ethical considerations coincide, but in some instances, they may be in conflict. This means that in an archaeological project, archaeologists must be aware and exercise professional judgment in their practical responses to ethical considerations and be willing to be held accountable for their judgments. Currently, there is an ongoing debate regarding the ethics of excavation and recovery of human remains with several conflicting views. The key approach set out in the British Association for Biological Anthropology and Osteology Code of Ethics is to act with integrity and to be open and transparent in dealing with human remains. Their code also ensures that Principle 3 of the CIFA Code of Conduct, that the member shall conduct his or her work in such a way that reliable information about the past be acquired and shall ensure that the results be properly recorded. And Principle 4, that the member has responsibility for making available the results of archaeological work with reasonable dispatch, are met in terms of quality and work and adherence to guidance documents and standards. The CIFA Code of Conduct has 5 principles, the other 3 being Principle 1, that a member shall adhere to high standards of ethical and responsible behaviour in the conduct of archaeological affairs. Principle 2, that the member has a responsibility for the conservation of the historic environment. And Principle 5, the member shall recognise the aspirations of employees, colleagues and helpers with regard to all matters related to employment, including career development, health and safety, terms and conditions of employment and equality of opportunity. Many of these frameworks have similar guidance, considering the treatment of both the living and the dead. As archaeologists, we should be aware that we are often subject to these different codes of conduct or ethics, and that our actions should be tailored according to the guidance provided. In some cases, further discussion may be required to ensure that any methodology considered does remain above reproach in terms of its ethical considerations to the concept of good reason. The World Archaeological Congress 1989 Vermilion Accord on Human Remains sets out that respect for mortal remains of the dead shall be accorded to all, irrespective of origin, race, religion, nationality, custom, and tradition. Respect for the wishes of the dead concerning disposition shall be accorded wherever possible, reasonable and lawful, when they are known or can be reasonably inferred. Respect for the wishes of local communities and of relatives or guardians of the dead shall be accorded whenever possible, reasonable and lawful. Respect for the scientific research value of skeletal, mummified and other human remains, including fossil hominids, shall be accorded when such value is demonstrated to exist. Agreement on the disposition of fossil, skeletal, mummified or other remains shall be reached by negotiation on the basis of mutual respect for the legitimate concerns of communities for the proper disposition of their ancestors, as well as the legitimate concerns of science and education. The express recognition that the concerns of various ethnic groups, as well as those of science, are legitimate and to be respected, will permit acceptable agreements to be reached and honoured. The 2001 UNESCO Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage acknowledged the importance of underwater cultural heritage as an integral part of the cultural heritage of humanity, and as a particularly important element in the history of peoples and nations and their relationships with each other concerning the common heritage. The Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage came into force in 2001, and while the UK is not a signatory, we do abide by its annex, and those working in the discipline tend to follow its guidance. It does not regulate the ownership of submerged heritage, but it ensures its safeguarding of underwater cultural heritage remains in international waters. Article 1 defines that human remains which have been partially or totally underwater periodically or continuously for at least 100 years are considered as underwater cultural heritage, with Article 2 stating that proper respect will be given to all human remains located in maritime waters. Under the general principle of the annex to the convention, Rule 5 states that activities directed at underwater cultural heritage shall avoid the unnecessary disturbance of human remains or venerated sites, and has both an ethical and advisory context to its wording concerning that any disturbance of human remains. Once the ethical and legal aspects of discoveries have been arranged or discussed, we turn to the matter of what to do with the human remains. The decision as to whether any discovered remains are archaeological or forensic, fortunately, is the responsibility of the police and their advisors, rather than you as the discoverer. Assuming the discovery is not a chance find, but has occurred as part of an active survey or excavation project on the site, your records would feed into their decision-making process in terms of how they proceed, and as to whether the find was considered archaeological or forensic. The engagement of an osteologist or anthropologist as part of the project team who can confirm material as human or non-human would at this point help to ensure that once discovered, they can be rapidly identified as such and reported. At this point, all operations should have ceased and relevant records and images prepared for passing to the police and MOD if relevant. This includes any personal images or records taken. Public discussion, sharing of images, and any notification of the media should be avoided to avoid unwarranted intrusion or speculation until such time as any police investigation has been completed. Depending on the type of project proposed, the engagement of a subject specialist in terms of potential associated items or inclusions may also help feed into the understanding of any discovery in its context, helping to minimize disturbance of any unexpected remains or to help preempt the disturbance of unexpected remains. An example of this might be someone specializing in historic aircrew or naval personal equipment, identifying equipment that would only be present on a member of the crew rather than an on-board item of the aircraft or vessel. If articulated skeletons are encountered and lifted during excavation, every effort should be made to recover them as individuals. Reuniting disarticulated bones into individuals is possible only to a limited extent, so there is substantial permanent loss of information if articulated skeletal material becomes mixed. The precise location of skeletal material in the three-dimensional space should be recorded before they are lifted. To some extent, the location of skeletal remains in a wreck is a function of where individuals met their deaths, and therefore is key to trying to understand events. Following their recovery, post-excavation processing of human bones begins with washing in fresh water to remove salinity. This may take some time to achieve. In the case of the Mary Rose, 4 weeks in a water cascade. Once the bones have been desalinated in this way, they should be allowed to dry slowly. And this is generally done in an air-dried environment. They're air-dried without using forced air or heat in order to avoid damaging them or drying them out too quickly and causing cracking. Once dry, they should be marked, bagged, and boxed using established guidelines for human skeletal remains excavated on land. The use of stabilizing conservation treatments should be avoided, and the remains should then be subject to an osteological assessment in the usual way. And if assessment indicates the desirability of such, their analysis, publication, and archiving should be undertaken, follow the established guidelines. However, this information is really only for awareness rather than rather than for practice, as it is extremely unlikely that you will need to do more than basic first aid conservation on any remains recovered before they are passed the osteology team. So what can we learn from the bones? Marine archaeological research themes for skeletal material can be separated into attritional and catastrophic populations. The latter are from sudden events, whereas the former is what would be expected in a normal population over time, with varying causes of death within the population. Catastrophic samples do, of course, require a different approach to attritional assemblages. Those from the latter part of the 19th and 20th centuries tend to be based in part on better records and therefore concentrate on the personal identification of remains. This is the same approach in effect as carried out by modern disaster victim identification and missing in action techniques used by various armed forces around the world, and therefore beyond what most vocational archaeological projects would look at to be involved with. It is therefore remains from earlier than this, when personal identification is unlikely, that archaeological research questions lead. These predominantly concern composition and recruitment, lifestyle, health and disease, occupation and origin of the remains. The example we have here can look at depositional details from marine growth on the bone, an estimation of the time and water, the pathology, so any injuries to the bone, any underlying conditions, the sex of the skeletal remains, age at death, stature, diet, biogeographic origins. When it comes to human remains, there's always been quite a little bit of controversy about sort of race and origin. And unfortunately, that rather sort of racist undertone that has crept in the past in terms of how it has been exploited. However, being able to understand people's biogeographic origin helps understand human movements around the planet, and where people's origins are from. And whereas we can look at it and find in some respects it's quite distasteful, there is also that need to return remains to communities they might have been taken from or stolen from, and also to understand in terms of how to deal with those remains in a respectful way in order either to return them or to rebury them, or if they are to be retained, how they are held and used within a museum or scientific context. Geographic mobility, a classic example of that one is the Amesbury Archer, with origins in Eastern Europe and then moving to the UK. And then, of course, there is the age of remains and carbon-14 dating where that is possible. With many of these, the quality of the work you can do is very, very much dependent on what survives. To give a bit of background, this example is a partial human crania that was recovered in 2017 off the Sussex coast after a 2-hour trawl by a local fisherman. No other remains were recovered at the time, and none had been reported in the area previously. It was reported to Sussex Police, and Wessex archaeologist, senior archaeologist Jackie McKinley identified it as a female crania with cribia orbitalia present, indicating iron deficiency in the diet, suggesting that it was probably archaeological in terms of its date, though it should be noted that the condition is also seen in modern populations. The marine growth and staining suggested that the crania had lain in several positions on the seabed over time. This is shown by the significant marine growth on the upper part, and where at some point following its separation from the other parts of the crania, it appears to have lain upside down based on the staining visible on the inside. There are no visible new fractures or breaks in the bone, suggesting that the breaks across the bone and the separations at the suture lines occurred at a similar time at some point in the distant past. The damage to the diplo, the spongy calcaneus bone separating the inner and outer cortical layers of the crania, is probably due to a combination of taphonomic and marine invertebrate action. The degree of degradation means the likelihood of success of DNA or other analysis is unlikely due to the contamination and denaturing of this material. Although most of the 6 species of marine fouling organisation collected have broad tolerances to depth, they are generally only found at depths of above 50 metres, with the presence of the S. spinulosa pointing to no less than 10 metres. Within this range, the P-Lamarck would indicate an original location no deeper than 30 meters, with the growth of the membranacea pointing to a depth of around 20 meters. Additionally, a depth of 20 meters is more likely when the low population density of the different fowling species is noted, as this decreases with depth due to the higher impairment of their filter feeding ability. The level of silty sediment in an environment will also affect the development, ability to feed, and the population density of some of the species present, as well as acting as an indicator of the surrounding seabed material where used in the construction of tubes. This points to a silty sediment with deposits of sand, shells, shingle, or gravel. The pattern of overlay between the different species gives a sequence and seasonal pattern to the exposure and depths that the cranium may have been at, indicating that it has been exposed for at least 10 months prior to its recovery based on the size, development, and layering of the different species. Though this does not preclude previous exposure in periods or areas that did not favour the development of those species. This also shows that the damage to the bone predominantly occurred before the establishment of the different marine worms tubes that cover the outer surfaces. The specialist report suggested that the initial location for the cranium was the Stevenson Shoal off Dungeness. As the remains were not found associated with any known wreck or other remains, how they arrived at this point of recovery is currently unknown. They may have been associated with either a wreck, someone lost overboard, or from the shore. The answer is unlikely to ever be found. They do now form part of the Bournemouth University teaching collection. Taphonomy. The damage to the crania in the previous slide received during its immersion is referred to as taphonomic damage and relates to what happens to a body between death and recovery of the surviving remains, in this case, the partial remains of the crania. Assessment of this damage and its causes allows for inference of the sequence of events that have led to the current condition of the remains. This assessment also includes the events around the time of death. However, it should be noted that there can be more than one cause for the potential taphonomic changes observed, and therefore the need for cross-referencing and hypothesis testing are often needed to refine the results. The images on this slide show, amongst other things, the damage caused by gastropod radula to long bone ends. These unfortunately have few definable characteristics in order to identify the individual gastropods, and therefore that range of depths and possible environment they're in. What is very clear is that the speed and the amount of damage they do cause, however, suggests that bioerosion is the major destructive force for any remains they have access to. Other areas that have been poorly researched include microscopic marine borers from a taphonomic viewpoint, and in particular their potential to act as indicators of marine exposure. So the basic list, when you're looking at potential bone modification and taphonomic changes, is chemical damage, generally due to an acid or alkaline environment, pathological damage, in an injury after the event, fluvial mechanics, so basically what your tides are doing, vertebrate modification, invertebrate modification, fungal and algal erosion, plant modification, and then bioturbation, where things are moved around within the sediment layers or soil. So in summary, the study of human remains should be viewed as a privilege and not a right. Repatriation and reburial of archaeological human remains occurs at varying intensities around the world, and one should be very aware of what potential communities feel about the return of remains and the ethics of the issues. And opinions vary, and therefore each case should be treated as a separate situation. All interested parties should have equal rights to engage in debates about the treatment of human remains, though it should be acknowledged that not all parties will be informed as others. In some parts of the world, human remains have not always been treated with respect. The value of the study of human remains in contribution to our knowledge is undoubted. More debate is definitely needed about issues for UK-derived human remains. Laws and guidelines regarding the ethical and legal treatment on human remains in the UK exist. And the public in the UK are generally favourable to the excavation, analysis, curation and display of remains, and retention of remains does need to be justified. Finally, people have a fascination with human remains, both past and present. Advice and guidance can be accessed through the QR code or through the link, and I hope you have found this presentation informative and the advice of some use. The key take-home message, therefore, is that on encountering potential human remains, you should stop, avoid unnecessary disturbance, inform the relevant authorities, do not post images and details online, and seek competent advice. Thank you.
So thank you, Alistair, from MSDS Marine and Heritage. It was a fascinating talk and very useful, I'm sure. We'd like to thank Historic England for ensuring that these bite-sized webinars are free for everyone to attend, and also they will be on YouTube for perpetuity so that people can continue to learn from them. So please check out the other 9 webinars that are available on YouTube.